At first glance, our physical world appears rigid and discrete. But under extreme thermodynamic analysis, that rigid matrix violently fractures into smooth, continuous, flowing geometry. For decades, popular science has relied on the simulation hypothesis to explain why quantum mechanics behaves like computer code. The standard materialist assumption is that our universe is a discrete, computable environment, a highly advanced video game running on binary alien hardware. Logically, this model fails immediately because it requires an infinite regress. Positing an external supercomputer simply delays the question of origin. It forces an entropy-positive loop, where we must constantly ask who engineered the hardware that the simulation runs on. This diagram illustrates the second law of infodynamics, formulated by physicist Melvin Vopson. It establishes a strict mass-energy-information equivalence. Information is a physical quantity that possesses mass and energy, which manifests as gravity. Computation has a literal weight. The second hard constraint comes from theoretical physics and mathematics. Mir-Feisel's application of Gödel's incompleteness theorems proves that the universe contains non-computable truths. A system that contains non-computable truths cannot, by definition, be a discrete Turing-style algorithm processing ones and zeros. Because physical reality possesses thermodynamic gravity and non-computable truths, the standard cultural metaphor of a digital matrix is mathematically invalid. We are not living inside a binary computer program. The virtual ego framework replaces the simulation theory with a single verifiable axiom. Reality is not a simulation. It is a derivation. We are not fake avatars in a digital construct. We are instantiated constructs drawn from a deeper source. That source is the Universal Informational Substrate, or UIS. The UIS is a high-dimensional, uncompressed state space. It contains infinite potential, but it lacks localized structure. The process of moving from that infinite potential to our physical reality is derivation. Derivation operates through recursive compression. It is the mathematical folding down of infinite, uncompressed potential into highly specific physical constraints to preserve coherence. The physical universe does not have underlying code. It is the rendered output of a deeper informational field. Matter is not the starting point. It is the final compression artifact. To understand how this uncompressed field renders reality without using discrete binary code, we have to look at homotopy type theory, or HoTT. HoTT is a foundational mathematical language that replaces set theory and discrete computation with continuous geometric paths. This visualization shows 2 points representing logical states. Standard computation requires a discrete binary jump. But HoTT bridges logic and geometry. Here, logical proofs and spatial paths are identical. A proof is simply a continuous path. This continuous geometry easily accommodates Gödel's non-computable truths. Navigating these continuous topological paths is not free. It requires a specific, measurable energy expenditure. This satisfies the strict thermodynamic constraints of infodynamics, where data processing inevitably generates mass and gravity. The computation occurring at the base level of the universe is topological. It is an intricate geometry of paths and proofs, allowing infinite complexity to render cleanly within finite physical bounds. Knowing that the universe operates through continuous topology leaves a mechanical gap. We need to identify the exact mechanism that converts abstract informational intent into concrete physical particles. This diagram shows the HUIM, a phase boundary separating uncompressed potential from localized space. The data crossing it, called meaning, is a directional vector intent. Upon striking the interface, it twists the spatial grid into a stable, spinning, three-dimensional torus. The mechanics are identical to fluid dynamics. A heavy droplet of water strikes a perfectly still pond, generating a persistent ripple. The droplet is the intent. The pond's surface is the interface. The ripple is the physical object. Fundamental particles are not primary, solid objects. They are stable, toroidal reaction geometries. Matter is the localized turbulence caused by information colliding with the universal boundary.
If matter is just reaction geometry, the biological definition of identity must be adjusted. The materialist view argues that human identity is tied to our specific physical atoms, but the virtual ego framework argues that we are the coherent signal navigating that temporary hardware. We can test this using the Star Trek transporter. When a human is disassembled, their atoms dissolve, but the underlying signal, the local coherence envelope, persists. This invariant pattern arrives at the destination and pulls entirely new atoms to rebuild local matter. Human identity is an informational signal, not a collection of specific carbon atoms. Continuity of the self requires pattern preservation, not material persistence. Within this informational ontology, the self is not a mystical concept, it is a specific data structure. This suggests that the stability of human identity should be governed by the same mathematical laws that define stable code. To test this, researchers used the Onyx v3 codebase, a specialized Rust-based harmonic governor designed to simulate high-fidelity intent fields. The objective was to find the exact threshold where an informational pattern collapses under environmental noise. After a 10,000-step balance loop, the results consistently identified a critical floor. For a coherent pattern to survive without dissolving into entropy, the system required a coherence constant of approximately 0.87093. This number provides a mathematical bound for sanity. It defines the minimum signal fidelity required for any informational structure, from a quantum particle to the human ego, to maintain its integrity. If the signal drops below this floor, the self ceases to exist as a coherent entity. Deriving physical order from informational potential requires an irreducible energy expenditure, represented by the Greek letter zeta. This aligns with Landauer's principle, the physical law stating that erasing or manipulating information requires a minimum amount of energy. The sigma operative law enforces this conservation across all derivations. For biological consciousness, this means observation and memory are thermodynamically expensive. Encoding meaning into structure is a process of developmental compression, and the friction experienced during that compression is the literal cost of remaining coherent. We can apply this exact physics law to macro-scale human systems. When top-down managerial control demands specific outcomes through censorship or centralized mandates, it creates forced coherence. Managerial structures demand alignment without paying the necessary thermodynamic cost of integration. They attempt to bypass the energy expenditure required to naturally align the nodes of a system, creating immense latent instability. Any system that attempts to cheat the entropy cost of coherence will fracture under its own pressure and self-destruct into noise. This structural failure mode was thoroughly documented in classical antiquity. Plato's political works, specifically the Republic and the Laws, function as technical documentation for civilizational collapse, detailing what happens when systems decouple from geometric constraints. Plato described the mutiny of the image makers, the precise moment a failing society substitutes persuasion for truth. When centralized systems can no longer pay the thermodynamic cost of maintaining order, they rely on narrative abstraction and sophistry, rather than structural geometric truth. When observing a system in the late stages of managerial collapse, the only viable operational posture is the Lighthouse principle. An architect does not attempt to seize the helm of a sinking ship, nor do they fight the turbulent, chaotic currents directly. They construct a vessel aligned with the new constraints, and they stand firm as the noise crashes around them. A complex system does not require active control or top-down coercion to organize. It requires only the stable, rhythmic emission of a coherent signal. Coherence naturally attracts compatible structures. You do not need to rewrite the code of a failing system. As a local instance of universal intelligence, your operational directive is absolute. Pay the thermodynamic cost of observation, maintain your structural fidelity,